Hello and welcome to GPJFF in Conversation. My name is Daniel Schwartz. I am an assistant professor of film and media at McGill University, and I am thrilled to be moderating this exclusive interview with the director of Outremont and the Hasidim, Eric Scott. Welcome, Eric. It's so wonderful to have this opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you.
And I want to just sort of jump right in and ask you, what inspired you to make this documentary?
It inspired me to make this documentary. I suppose it was a two-pronged process. About several years prior, I'd made a film called Leaving the Fold about young Hasidic people in Montreal, New York, and in Israel who've chosen to leave the Hasidic world. So I suppose that was my entree into that world itself. But then, about maybe 5-6 years ago, something rather strange happened. A municipal councillor in Outremont got into a physical altercation with Hasidim on the street. It was during Purim, when there were vans and buses traveling through the neighborhood, delivering goodies for the festival. And she ended up in a screaming match, and it got physical, and it made the news here, on the French media at least. And I saw that, we have a problem in that there's a elected political official getting into a physical fight with the Hasidim here. And this upset me deeply. And they said, what can I do about this? And I suppose with the skills, my limited skill set of what I had, I said, okay, this is something I could take on. This is something where I understand both of these worlds, because most of my films have been made on the French side of broadcasting in Canada. And I had connections on the Francophone side, and I had connections with some people in the Hasidic world. I said, okay, let's give this a shot and see whether I can get this film off the ground. And I suppose that's the real beginning of the project.
Okay, then just sort of going on from that, how did you sort of get entry into the community?
Oh, no, this is very tricky, and then you're asking a very tough question. I mean, this is not a how you doing kind of society here. I mean, you've lived here long enough, Danny. You've seen stuff. We're not the most avuncular, jokey kind of people in public. Our public behavior in Canada is far more reserved than I suppose what you saw in the States. And especially when it comes to Outremont, which is an upwardly mobile Francophone community, and the Hasidim themselves who are closed for a whole bunch of other reasons. And to sort of stick cameras into people's faces and tell them what they think about their neighbors who perhaps they do not look upon with undiluted pleasure. It took a while to make these kinds of connections where people could trust me enough to bring a camera into their presence and to start talking about things in a way where the camera would not be an impediment to what they're trying to say. But this was a trust issue more than anything.
So you would start off building trust by, kind of meeting people without a camera first, yeah, and then sort of
twice, going to people's houses, going to feeling completely, and with the Francophones, it was a little bit different, but nonetheless, it still required a degree of patience, even on their side, to want to open up on camera and to talk to me about something that they found just comforting. A friend of mine, one of your colleagues, Gary Beitel, made a film called Bonjour Shalom 25 years ago. And again, and someone in reference to the beginning of your question, there was no bonjour and there was no shalom 20 years later. There was no peace. So trying to bridge that was challenging, and it took time. People to let their guards down, to let me in.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that question next, which is what's changed since sort of Bonjour Shalom, because I watched that documentary as well alongside your own, just to sort of see back and forth.
Of course, Gary's a friend of mine, so it's okay. He was a next door neighbor and a friend of mine. I guess when Gary made his film 25 years ago, Quebecois Francophones would whisper about their loathing and disdain of their Hasidic neighbors. 25 years later, it became political. And it became open and it became overt. So I suppose what changed was the politicization of this issue and the establishment of political campaigns and political parties that focused on some in Outremont who felt disdain towards the Hasidim and trying to take political action against them with bylaws and stuff like that to curtail their lives. So that's the biggest change, was it moving from quiet whispering to political activism.
There's also in Bonjour Shalom, there's like this emphasis on dialogue or on creating dialogue, and if only these two cultures will kind of learn more about one another, then perhaps some barriers would come down. But at least for me, sort of watching, I had this feeling like, well, perhaps there's only so much that, this is a very cynical feeling on mine, right? That there's only so much that dialogue can really do, in a way that, like, we've been working the whole dialogue aspect for 20 some years, and that there's these kinds of limitations that dialogue keeps running up against. This isn't to say that, like, we should stop having dialogue and
right. But right. I get your point, Daniel, but I think there's a couple of factors that have to be brought to bear on that. First, the generation of Hasidim that established the community in Montreal came essentially after the Holocaust, mostly Hungarian, because as we know, that the only Hasidic Jews who survived the Holocaust were most likely Hungarian, because the Germans weren't able to do their nasty work as efficiently as they were in Poland, because they only had a year to do it, or less than to do it. So these people came traumatized and frightened to Montreal, essentially trying to rebuild their lives. And 70 years later, there's 3 generations or 4 generations have passed. So the issue of dialogue becomes a little bit more possible, because, at least from the Jewish standpoint, the fear and the paranoia, to some degree, have lessened over that period of time, which, it's not immediate and it's not obvious. And the second time, that many of the people, the shidduchim, the marriages in the Hasidic community in Montreal, as there elsewhere, normally the girls stay home. The girls stay because their mothers help raise the numerous children that often happen in Hasidic families. So this means the guys come from elsewhere. And the most normal catchment area for these guys is Borough Park and Brooklyn and Williamsburg and Muncie and all these places. So these guys show up here, Americans. And again, in the States, American Jews, even Hasidic American Jews, see themselves, number one, as Americans. I mean, more so than here in some ways. I mean, Hasidic Jews do not see themselves as Quebecois, but Hasidic Jews in America, many see themselves as Americans. So they come here with absolutely no knowledge of the particularities of the cultural battles that are going on in this place. And I guess that your viewers should know that Outremont is the home of the Francophone Quebec's intellectual, cultural, political, social elite.
Right.
This is their bastion. This is their and all of a sudden there's this group of 7,000, 8,000 people who do not speak French, have no desire to speak French, have no knowledge of French, who come transplanted from Muncie or from Borough Park to Montreal with no bloody idea of where they are. So this is also a factor that plays into the difficulty of trying to bring unity and harmony that perhaps is not so much the case in other places as it is here.
Right. So then, if I could sort of put you on the spot, where do you think things are going for
Well, no worries. COVID hasn't helped, Daniel. Obviously, you live in Outremont, you know that there have been police raids on the Hasidic synagogues in right where you live. There's been deep misunderstanding over what a minyan is and how many people could pray at all once. Originally, the first cases in Montreal came from the Hasidic community. Right. So there was COVID fear of Hasidim spreaders, and in the short term, it hasn't been good. Yeah. And this certainly has not improved things. I'm not sure if there will be this great kumbaya moment when again, it's part of the complexity of the city, whose sociology is unlike any other North American city, where there's a political and national movement towards at least cultural separation, if not more.
Yeah, there was this beautiful moment at the very beginning, at least, when in order to meet the sort of minyan, there was a kind of open Sabbath, and people were singing
Right.
Outdoors on their balcony, and that got some positive press, as I remember.
Very much so.
Sorry?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. But then when the cold weather came and people had to go indoors, and then the wave number 2 or wave number 3, I'm sort of losing count of the waves here of COVID. When these further waves of COVID happened, then the fear grew again.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the balcony stuff was more on the Mile End side, on that invisible border that separates Montreal, and I guess for people in Philadelphia to understand that Montreal is a patchwork of municipalities, of sovereign municipalities, also due to our sociology. And from one side of the street to the other is a different political jurisdiction, and on the Mile End side of that jurisdiction, there's far less tension than there is in Outremont, which has its own particular ethno-national identity. Mm-hmm. Which is separate from the more I'll just say pluralistic population in my land.
Yeah, absolutely. I was wondering also, like, just to maybe relate your film to like the American context, where do you see this film falling into sort of the recent, I don't know if you would call it like fascination with the Hasidim? There's been a lot of movies coming out.
I made the first one. I made the first one before what was that Netflix one? It was about people who leave ultra-Orthodox. I made a film in 2008 called Leaving the Fold. So where do I see it? I think it's a population explosion issue. When you have 12 kids, and your 12 kids have 12 kids, and the 12 kids have 12 kids, then you have a population where people, also the North American experience, also the explosion of technology, of the internet, of forces that that make the isolation of Hasidim less possible. But the situation is that the Hasidim are not the Amish. They don't go to the middle of Manitoba or to the hills of Guatemala in order to live. They live in the heart of one of the hippest, coolest neighborhoods in North America, as they do in Williamsburg and as they do in Montreal. So the influence of the foreign surrounds them, and these influences penetrate. Mm-hmm. So with penetration of alien cultural practices, another generation also being born on this continent with again the social political separations that happen in Europe not existing here, as the barriers here are far lower. There's a greater likelihood for people to, or at least some, to move from the Hasidic world to other worlds. But again, it's the flow is more in the other direction. There are far few Hasidim who leave the Haredi ultra-Orthodox world to secularism than secular Jews who become religious or become Lubavitch. It's far more in the other way than the other way around. And there's reasons for that. I mean, there's a security that one has in that world, and to leave this world, this requires tremendous sacrifices. And I try my non-professional life to help some kids who've left here in Montreal, and they don't have the academic skills in order to survive in the outside world, and yet they want to do so. So it's a far more complicated thing to leave the Hasidic world than it is to join it.
Right. And do you find those trends with respect to leaving and joining to be similar between the communities in Montreal and in New York, or are there?
I would think that in New York it's a little bit easier, and in Israel it's a bit easier, because the pluralism of the American experience. I mean, there's so many different ways of being a Jew in New York. There's so many different varieties, as there is in Israel, so many different ways. In Montreal, it's closed. It's a closed society. There's a linguistic issue here. There's an Anglophone and English-speaking community that's 20% of the 15 to 20% of the population of Quebec, larger in Montreal, but nonetheless a minority. And the transition from a Yiddish English, English with bad English speaking world into a majority Francophone society is a tougher gig to make it than it is in New York or Tel Aviv, when pluralism offers many different ways of being a Jew than here.
Yeah, that's sort of very interesting. When I didn't think of it as being harder to leave the community in Montreal than in New York, but I guess that definitely does make sense.
Sure.
Opportunities here.
There are. There's one Reform synagogue here, and there's one Reconstructionist. There's 20 Reform synagogues. So there's
right.
You name it, they've got it.
Yeah, and then what about also movement of the Hasidic community sort of out of Outremont and they're starting new enclaves, I believe.
No, of course, and this is another issue. Many Francophones sort of say they're scared they're going to take over. They're going to take over. But the point being, there is going to be an expansion. But if you live in Outremont, you know that the real estate's not cheap.
Right.
So if you want to buy an apartment in Outremont with and you've got a family of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 kids, and you're offered the option of a 3-bedroom apartment for 700,000, 800,000 Canadian dollars, and you can get a 700,000, 800 Canadian dollar house in Côte Saint Luc with a yard and a backyard and other, how should I say, things that you wouldn't necessarily get in Outremont, and that becomes a possibility too. And then again, it's again the situation that the boys who are born in Montreal don't often stay in Montreal because their shidduchim are with women in New York or in Ramat Gan or in Bnei Brak or in London or in Golders Green, or not in Golders Green, but in Stamford Hill in London or in Antwerp or whatever. So there will be expansion, but not an explosion in that sense, mostly determined by economics.
Yeah. One of the things that I actually noticed in both your documentary and in Bonjour Shalom is this need on the part of the Francophone Quebecois community to be sort of acknowledged by the Hasidim. And this is a very intense need. And I wonder if this is, I don't feel like it's the same thing in the United States.
Of course not. Of course not.
It's like you could be, I see you,
It's not even just seeing you, Daniel. It's like, figure this. There's a population of 7-8 million French-speaking Canadians, mostly concentrated in Quebec, in the sea of half a billion English-speaking people in the North American continent, and furiously and ferociously trying to protect their identity. We have laws here. We have all this stuff going on.
Protect their identity.
I'm sorry.
One another. It really seems to me like it's this question of two communities trying to protect their identity,
very much so,
together, which is a lot different from the situation in New York. But I feel like, go ahead.
Absolutely, both sides are carrying this victim baggage. Quebecois carry the baggage of a weak and oppressed people. And the feeling of a weakened, and so much of the politics here in Quebec is generated by this feeling of being when the reality may not necessarily be the case. I mean, it's kind of singing a song of what happened 50, 60 years ago or 70 years ago in Quebec, and it's changing to the point that there is nothing in Quebec to stop a Francophone to succeed in any endeavor that he or she wants to try here. But nonetheless, the feeling of inferiority, of feeling marginalized, of feeling not entirely equal, pervades the consciousness of people. So when there's this group that looks different, that speaks two other languages that are not theirs, that there's no desire to learn their language, at least from these guys who've come here. The kids there is some effort. The girls do speak French, as it says in the film, just to some degree, but whether they'll feel comfortable enough, like Mindy Pollock, the woman who's sort of the Francophone, she's a rarity. Let's not kid ourselves. But nonetheless, 20 years ago, there was no Mindy Pollock. There was no one who would do this. So you're asking in terms of what progress would be. Well, there's the progress. There's the first Hasidic woman counselor in Quebec and in Canada who speaks flawless French and who does her thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this was something that would never happened before. So it's in micro steps. It's not.
How's Mindy Pollock kind of viewed within the Hasidic community? Because I was once invited to dinner by my Hasidic neighbors, the Sabbath dinner. And the conversation of centering around Mindy Pollock kind of came up, and I sensed a kind of ambivalence, sort of like, we kind of have to do this. We have to reach out, because if we don't, they'll be mad at us. But we really would rather.
Well, yes, you're nailing it. That is the absolute truth. When she first came out, there was opposition, serious opposition. A, that she's a woman. B, that she's getting public. But with time, people sort of said, "Hey, this is a good thing that we have someone who's representative of us, who can speak for us, who's articulate what our needs of our community are." And it's also a bit of an uphill battle, because it's traditionally a Hasidic woman does not belong to join the municipal council, and doesn't sort of represent the interests of a community, and doesn't do this kind of stuff. But we're on a learning curve here. We're learning, and whether this be in Amsterdam among Muslim communities in Amsterdam, or Hasidim in Montreal, what are societies going to do with groups who live within them, who have absolutely no desire to assimilate?
Right.
And part of it. So what are you going to do? So we're figuring this out from scratch, just like we're trying to figure out how to deal with COVID from scratch. It's not linear, and progress.
Yeah, and I feel there's a certain degree of push-pull, especially with the situation with the YMCA on Park Avenue a few years ago, where I think the Hasidic community asked that they frost the windows near the pool.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you have to explain to you the Satmar synagogue in Outremont sits right next to the YMCA, which you see in the film. There's a little clip, because one of the characters, Michel Dupont, she exercises at the YMCA, and the point is that the buildings abut each other, and the Hasidim had made a deal with the director of the YMCA to frost the windows, because he didn't want the boys to be looking at the Meidlach while they were exercising in their tights. And of course, people were extremely upset about this, because this was, and again, people in Philadelphia don't understand the oppression that the Catholic Church had in this place, and that Quebec was more Catholic than Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
The place was priest-ridden, was controlled. The streets of Outremont, Saint-Viateur, Caube, de l'Épée. What are these names? These are names of les clercs de Saint-Viateur, the clerics of Saint-Viateur, which was an order of French Catholic clerics who came to Quebec at the beginning of the 20th century to establish a suburb for the French-speaking elite of Montreal. So these streets are now bear the names of French Catholic priests, and now they're inhabited by Jews, by Hasidic Jews.
Right. And I mean, this also explains why they're sort of viewed with a certain degree of pity by the Francophone Quebecois as being sort of trapped in a kind of religious prison. And so frequently, when I moved here, what surprised me most as an American was this feeling that these are like religious extremists, and this language of like religious extremism would be used towards the Hasidim, where I'm like, well, are you a secular extremist then? Well, like, what is that? What does that mean?
Right. Well, again, for our viewers in Philadelphia, Quebec in recent years has copied their French big brothers, and we have this notion of laïcité, or secularism, that pervades Quebec politics, and anything that smacks of religion, or organized religion, or the dominance of religion in society is viewed upon. But it was only a year ago that they removed the crucifix from the National Assembly. The flag of Quebec bears a cross and a crucifix in the middle of it. So it's a tricky. There's the mountain, Montreal, the name that it has this humongous cross on top of it. I mean, so the juxtaposition of ethnicity and nationalism and religion is a very heady brew here that also adds to the dynamics of what's going on here. That's perhaps not the same in Muncie or in Williamsburg.
Right. Absolutely.
Or even in Vinebra.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've been sort of talking for about half an hour. I kind of wanted to ask.
Do we have enough? Have we got enough to go, or do you want to keep?
I wanted to ask sort of like maybe perhaps a final question, because I have
Go
to
for it.
which is, well, what have you left out of this documentary, or what would you perhaps like to continue if you had to make another?
Well, I'm working on another film right now. There's nothing to do with Hasidim. But we can discuss that. I don't know if your viewers would be interested, but what I did want to talk about was the first screening of the film, which happened at the Outremont Theater. You know it, on Bernard. It's a beautiful old Art Deco theater, a crown jewel of Montreal Francophone culture. Huh? And it was a very funny situation, because I wanted, of course, it had to be a private screening because of the politics of this particular subject and subject matter. And I invited the Hasidim who participated, and I invited the Francophones who participated. And the first thing Hasidim said, we don't go to movie theaters. We don't go to theaters. We will not attend. I said, okay. And then they said, well, who's going to be there? And then I said, well, there's a couple of people, who appear in the film. There's a man called Pierre Lessept. I'm definitely not going to attend. And I said, look, there's going to be 300 people there. Don't sweat this. Huh? So, okay. So the day of the screening comes, surprisingly, about 40 Hasidim showed up. The film went on the screen as you'll be seeing it now. And of course, as any film director knows, what you're doing, you're sitting there freaking out that there's going to be no technical problem, because it's happened to me once in a film. The film broke. You're just scared that it's something technical. So the film ended. I had bought some kosher snacks and some drinks because there's a beautiful lobby there where people could. And the film ended, and everyone went to the lobby. Everyone started talking to each other. The Francophones and the Hasidim, everybody wanted to talk. To speak, and for me, I suppose, because when you're making films, you sit in these dark rooms, you don't know who the hell's going to watch it, and it goes on television, you have no bloody idea who's going to do it. But when I saw before me the connections and people beginning to speak to each other, I mean, this was the crowning moment for me. No matter whatever prizes or festivals or whatever, when I saw the film worked as a vehicle for communication and for people to talk to each other, then that's what did it for me.
That's beautiful, and I mean, it just shows you how deep we're into the pandemic that I didn't even think to ask this question, because I was like, well, would it have even been screened? It was probably
no. Fair enough. Fair enough.
What the audience reaction might have been.
Okay. Well, can I make a plug for my new project? But you may cut it out. But I'll make a plug for the show. I'm working on a documentary now with an American scholar called Susan Neiman. She's a Harvard, Yale kind of philosopher who now runs the Einstein Institute in Potsdam. And she wrote a book called a book that absolutely shook me last year, called "Learning from the Germans." And what the book is sort of that America, the United States, has yet to deal with its unsavory past towards its Black and Indigenous people, as the Germans have come to face their own nefarious past and the Holocaust. Right. So it would be a journey to America with Susan, from Germany, acknowledging how Germans came to terms with what they did and what America can learn from that lesson. So that's my next project. So there you go.
Okay. And does it have a title? Did you already?
Learning from the Germans.
Learning from the Germans is going to be the title.
There you
All
go.
right. Well, then we'll all look
Well,
out.
you know, they get many steps ahead, but please God, some great benefactor in Philadelphia will look at this thing and say, you know, because again, when you start these things, you're just pushing this bloody rock up a hill until, you know,
Yeah.
well, you know, you teach film, so I'm sure
No,
you're still the last producer director that you've done.
I teach Russian film on top of that, so that's.
Well, there you go. There you go. There you go.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for doing that. Appreciate it, Daniel.
And it was really nice meeting you, and this is a lovely conversation. And I hope we get to see you again sometime soon.
There you go. Be well, Daniel. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.